Well, I want to welcome everyone to the International Methods Colloquium. The IMC is a periodic online interactive seminar discussion on the application of quantitative statistical methodology to the social sciences, sponsored by Rice University and the National Science Foundation. This week I'm sitting in for Justin Esri, and I'm pleased to have this week's speaker, Ines Levin from the University of California-Irvine. Her talk is entitled The Conditional Impact of Resources on Political Participation, Evidence from a Mixture Model. Nessa's talk is going to last between 30 and 40 minutes, she promises, after which point we'll take questions from the audience. You can ask a question using the Zoom Q&A button that appears at the bottom of your webinar window. A link to Ines's slideshow is going to be available on the Zoom webinar chat window so that you can refer to it throughout. I've already posted one version of it. Here comes another version of the slides. So now I'd like to welcome Ines to the IMC. Take it away, Ines.
Thank you. I would like to thank Justin for inviting me, Rick for taking the time to moderate the talk today, and I would also like to thank everyone who's tuning in. As Rick mentioned, I will be presenting a paper called The Conditional Impact of Resources on Political Participation, Evidence from a Mixture Model. So this paper is about a method for studying political participation. Let me maximize this full screen. Okay. So when I say that this is a method that's useful for studying political participation, so what do I mean? I mean that it's useful for studying individuals' decisions as to whether or not to participate in activities that may ultimately affect political outcomes. And whether this happens or not, okay, so whether participants are able to attain their goals depends not on the independent action of a single individual, but on the joint action of multiple individuals. So examples of political activities include voting, donating, working for political campaigns, attending political meetings, contacting government officials. I would also consider, for instance, involvement in formal and informal community activities, protesting, engaging in political discussion. So the definition that I'm using is pretty standard one in terms of what it means to participate in politics. So participating in this type of activities involves carrying out different types of tasks. So in the case of voting, it involves casting a ballot, for instance. In the case of contributing to campaigns and organizations, it will involve donating. In the case of contacting representatives and government officials, it involves writing letters, writing emails, picking up the phone and making a call. In the case of actively participating in the activities of groups, it might involve giving speeches or organizing group meetings, for instance. Okay, so performing all of these tasks is costly. Okay, so that is why we say that participating in politics requires having access to so-called politically relevant resources. Okay, so this type of resources include having time available to participate in political activities, being able to think about politics, so being able to gather and process political information and being able to use this information to make political decisions. Then also having had the chance to develop civic skills, such as being able to communicate ideas effectively to others, or being able to coordinate the actions of a group of people. So we typically, when we think about civic skills, we think that they are, people tend to develop them or acquire them within institutional settings. Okay, so for instance, in the context of having high status occupations or participating in the activities of organizations, not necessarily political organizations. Okay, and then in the case of activities such as donating, people of course need to have access to monetary resources in order to be able to perform the necessary tasks. Okay? So that participating in politics requires access to resources is something that has been discussed at length in the literature on political participation. And indeed, previous studies have consistently found that there is a positive association between access to certain types of resources and political participation. So for instance, it has been consistently found that on average, people who have higher levels of education and attainment participate more. So here is a picture that I think it's nice because it's kind of a metaphor for how we sometimes think about participation in political activities. Okay? So on the one hand, we have people who do not have access to the type of resources that I mentioned before. So for instance, they might have low levels of education and attainment, so they might not have had the chance to fully develop their cognitive abilities. They also haven't had the chance to participate in institutional settings that allow them to develop the type of civic skills that I mentioned before. They also might face challenging financial circumstances, so they don't have access to the type of monetary resources that will allow them to donate money, for instance. And since they face such difficult financial circumstances, they might have to work extra hours, and they might not have time available to participate in politics. Okay? And then on the other hand, we have people who do have access to this type of resources, and these are the ones who we typically expect will be more involved in different types of political activities.
Ines, would you do you want to put your slides up on the screen? They're not showing from where I sit.
No?
No.
Oh, because I forgot to press share screen. I'm sorry about that.
Yes, press share screen. Sorry.
I'm sorry about that. Okay. Sure.
Okay.
Okay, so
there you go. Excellent.
Okay. So this is the picture that I said. Let me now use full screen mode. So is it better now?
Yes. Excellent. Thank you.
Okay. So, but this picture is not an accurate representation of what's actually going on, because it is true. On average, people who do have more access to resources participate more, but there's a lot of variation in behavior that we cannot explain exclusively on the basis of whether people have or do not have access to the type of resources I mentioned before. Okay, so there are plenty of people with limited amounts of time available to participate in politics, limited access to monetary resources, and so on, who are very actively involved. Okay, who do not only vote, but they also work for campaigns, attend political meetings, contact with government officials, and so on. And conversely, there are people who are more well-off, who we would expect would be more deeply involved in political activities, and yet aren't. Okay? So they might not even be interested in engaging in political discussion. Okay? And this is something that has also been pointed out in the previous literature. So what is the goal of the paper? So the goal of my paper is to demonstrate how finite mixture modeling can be used to learn about latent participation intensities, okay, that drive certain individuals to systematically participate more than others, okay, that cannot be explained in terms of access to resources. Okay? And something else that another goal of my study is to use this model to evaluate how the impact of resources, okay, of a marginal increase in access to resources varies conditionally on these latent predispositions. Okay, so something that I would like to point out is that being able to measure these latent predispositions requires looking at variety of political activities, so activities that vary in terms of how demanding they are. Okay, so this is something that's easy to understand, like intuitively. So suppose that you only had information about whether people vote, whether people engage in political discussion, and suppose that you see that some people don't do any of these things that we typically do not consider to be very demanding. So we might conclude that, well, these people are probably kind of isolated from the political world. They are not interested in getting involved. But beyond that, there is not much more than we can say. So suppose that you do observe that people vote and people talk about politics. So we really cannot say much about the tendencies toward activism of these individuals unless we also observe them making decisions as to whether to volunteer to work for campaigns, whether to join boards and organizations, and so on. So if we want to kind of develop a more fine-grained classification in terms of people's tendencies to participate in politics, then we need to take a look at a wide range of political activities that vary, again, in terms of how demanding they are from the point of view of the individual. So, so the model that I'm going to be estimated identifies types of individuals who, holding access to resources constant, systematically participate more or less than others. Okay? And I expect to find two types of individuals in particular. Okay? So some people who behave as activists, who are those who over-participate, in the sense that they participate more than I would predict, purely on the basis of their access to resources. Okay? They vote more than I would expect, they donate more than I would expect, they volunteer to work for campaigns more than we would typically predict based on their access to resources. Okay, and so I also have some expectations regarding the frequency with which activists will participate in different kinds of activities. So I expect that they will almost always participate in low-cost activities. So these are people who are almost always going to vote, almost always going to want to engage in discussions about politics with others. Okay? But they won't always perform activities that are more demanding. Okay? So they will sometimes do things that are more costly. They will sometimes attend political meetings, volunteer to work for campaigns, contact government officials. These are things that they will often do, but not nearly all of the time. Okay. Then I expect to find individuals who behave in the exact opposite manner. Individuals who under-participate across activities. Who, if we were to make predictions about their behavior purely based on measures of the types of resources that I mentioned before, we would conclude that they are under-participating. They always tend to participate less than we would expect. And I also have some expectations when it comes to these individuals regarding the frequency of involvement in different types of activities. So I expect these types of participants, who I will denominate apathetics, to never participate in activities that are very demanding in terms of time required to participate, other types of resources required to participate, but to sometimes participate in low-cost activities. So I expect these people to sometimes vote, to sometimes talk about politics, and so on. And then I also have some expectations regarding how a marginal increase in access to resources will affect the likelihood that individuals who have different types will participate in different kinds of political activities. Okay? And so the expectations that I have regarding how the effect of resources varies across types are in part closely related to the expectations that I mentioned just before. So for instance, since activists are very likely, no matter what, to participate in activities that are not very demanding, if you provide greater access to resources for individuals who have this type, okay, so you give them more money, more time that they can dedicate to participating in politics. They have more access to money that they can choose to donate, and so on. So these people are already doing these things a lot. So if you give them more access to resources, it won't really increase the chance that they are going to perform this type of activities. Okay? So in the case of activists, I expect the effect of resources to be lower for less demanding activities and higher for more demanding activities. So in the case of things that they don't do all of the time, which they sometimes do, but not always, I expect effects to be larger, okay, in the case of activists. And then I expect the opposite for apathetics. So apathetics, there are things that they won't do. So even if they have more time and money that they can assign or use to participate in political activities, they and you give them more access to this type of resources, it won't increase their chance that they will participate in very demanding activities, but it might increase their chance that they participate in less demanding activities, such as voting, such as engaging in political discussion, and so on. Okay, so the model that I use is an extension of the standard model that we use to analyze people's decisions as to whether to participate or not on specific political activities. So let me start by reviewing a little bit the specification of the standard binary choice model, and then I will tell you how it is that I modify it in order to learn about these latent participation intensities that I mentioned before. So, so here, just to simplify the exposition, I'm going to be dropping the subscripts indexing individuals and activities. So suppose that Y star is a measure of the latent utility associated with participating in a certain activity. Okay? So we typically write that latent utility as a linear function of a set of individual attributes, X. Okay, so let's think about this vector X as a collection of measures of access to the type of resources I mentioned before. So we typically write this latent utility as being a function of an intercept A plus this vector X times B, which is a vector of slopes capturing the effect of individual attributes in X on the latent utility Y star, plus a disturbance term epsilon. Okay, so we typically assume that individuals are utility maximizers and that they are going to be participating in this political activity if Y star is greater than 0. Okay? And here is the key assumption that we usually make when we estimate a standard binary choice model that I'm going to be relaxing in this paper. Okay, so we typically assume that this epsilon, okay, disturbances are drawn from the same distribution for all individuals, and typically from distributions that are symmetrically distributed and centered around 0. Okay, so when we estimate this type of models, we assume that that individual identities only matters when it comes to determining the values of taken by independent variables included in the vector X. Okay, so once we determine the values of those variables for a certain person, we assume that the identity of the person is irrelevant. Okay, so later I'm going to explain how it is that I modify, okay, that I relax that assumption. So in the logistic case, we typically use a logistic link function to map representative utilities, which is a systematic component of Y star, A plus X times B, to participation probabilities. And this is an assumption that I'm going to maintain. Okay. Okay. So so what I'm going to be estimating is a model where the intercept A that I mentioned before varies across participatory types. Okay. So let me show you how you can go from the previous model to a model that has varying intercepts. Okay? So suppose that you have some individuals for whom error terms are symmetrically distributed, but centered away from 0. So you have some individuals where error terms are centered in a number that around the number that lies above 0, and for other individuals the mean lies below 0. So individuals in the first group are going to be predicted to participate systematically more than individuals in the second group. Okay. So if we admit this possibility, so we allow the mean of the distribution of the disturbance to vary across groups of individuals, then we can rewrite the error term as the sum of a 0 mean disturbance, okay, that we are now going to call Q, and a type-specific constant that I'm going to be calling U bar sub T. Okay, so that's a constant, okay, that captures the mean of the distributions of the disturbances displayed by the different types. And so we can write epsilon equal U plus U bar T. Okay? And so if we wanted to respecify the model that I presented before, what we can do is to take U bar sub t away from the disturbance and add it to the intercept. Okay? So now we can write down the new intercept as a tilde sub t, which equals the old intercept plus the type-specific constant U bar sub t. Okay? So this is going to be an intercept that varies across types. Okay? So some individuals are going to have higher intercepts, okay? Higher estimates of the intercept for a certain activity, while other individuals are going to have lower estimates of the intercept for the same activities. Okay? So individuals in the first group are going to be predicted to be more likely to participate in that activity than individuals in the second group, for instance. Okay? So the respecified latent utility Y star can be written as Y star equal a tilde sub t plus x times b plus u. Okay? So I won't be talking about details regarding the estimation procedure here because I don't have time. But something that I wanted to clarify is that in order to be able to estimate type-specific intercepts, I assume that individual types are fixed across activities. Okay, and the reason why I do that is because remember that let's recall the way in which I defined like someone having an activist type. So someone having an activist type is someone who systematically participates kind of more than we would expect based on a standard model, okay, across all activities. Okay? So if I want to learn about that type, then I need to fix the type across activities. Okay? And so it would be possible to write down a model specification that's more flexible than this, where you allow people to have certain types that imply high participation in certain activities and low participation in other activities. But in practice, identifying the parameters of such a model would be much more difficult than identifying the parameters of the model that I'm estimating. Okay? So because of data limitations, I prefer to start using a specification like the one that I just talked about before. So now let me turn to the results of the application that I've been working on so far. So far, I've applied this model to the analysis of the data from the American Citizen Participation Study that was conducted by Verba, Schlossman, Brady, and I in 1990. So this was a nationwide survey conducted during the spring of 1990 that included interviews to more than 2,500 voting age respondents. So for the purpose of my analysis, I will consider 11 binary indicators of participation in different types of activities. So I won't be looking at how much people do of each activity, but I'm merely going to be paying attention to whether they perform the activity or not. Okay? So this means that my indicators of participation won't be very informative. Okay? Each one carries just a tiny bit of information about the person's latent participation intensity, and that is in part why there's only so much that I can ask the model in terms of the person's latent type, and that's also a reason why I need to consider numerous indicators of involvement in kind of activities that vary a lot in terms of how demanding they are perceived to be from the point of view of individuals. Okay, so the type of activities I consider include voting, making monetary contributions, involvement in what Vera, Schlossman, and Brady, and I call time-based acts, which include participating in meetings, working for campaigns, kind of type of acts that require considerable time commitment, and also engaging in political discussion. So I write the latent utility as a linear function of common measures of access to resources, including education and attainment, income, a measure of job level, of job skills. So job skills is a scale that measures whether the individual has been asked, for instance, to organize meetings, to give speeches, etc., in the context of job activities. So people who report having been asked to perform certain tasks are coded as having more of this type of skills. Okay? Then vocabulary skills, okay, which is a scale calculated based on vocabulary test, and also amount of time spent at work, with the expectation that people who spend more time at work will have less time that they can dedicate to participating in political activities. And I also include a few demographic controls, including age, marital status, gender, and an indicator of non-white race. Okay, so the first result that I'm going to show you has to do with the probability that an average person in the sample is classified as having each of the three types. Okay, so remember, in estimating the model, I assumed that there were at most three types. So what I'm showing you here is the probability that this average person is classified as having either an activist type, a moderate type, or an apathetic type. And so the model doesn't classify the person as, doesn't always classify the person as kind of always having a certain type, but returns information about the probability that each individual in the sample has each of these three types. Okay, and also we don't learn about these probabilities with certainty. So there is, as with any estimated quantity, there is some associated uncertainty. So what I'm showing you here is the distribution of the probabilities that this average person in the sample is classified as having each of the three types. So the model assignment for the average person is to have a moderate type, so that that person is classified as a moderate about 45% of the time, as an apathetic about 34% of the time, and as an activist about 21% of the time. But there is a lot of variation in the sample in terms of the proportion of the time that different individuals are assigned to these three types. So just to illustrate that, I'm presenting here a ternary plot where dots corresponds to respondents in the American Citizen Participation Study. And so in order to interpret this plot, what we see is that points that are closer to a certain vertex of the ternary plot have higher probability of being assigned the type corresponding to that vertex. Okay, so if a point is closer to the vertex corresponding to an activist type, then that person is more likely to be assigned an activist type than a moderate type or apathetic type. And so here I'm showing you the same ternary plot, but I'm coloring individuals in blue, yellow, or red, depending on their modal type assignment. So points colored in red correspond to individuals who are classified as an activist more frequently than as a moderate or an apathetic. Okay? Points colored in yellow correspond to individuals that are classified as moderates more frequently than an activist or apathetics. And points colored in blue correspond to individuals that are classified as apathetics more frequently than as moderates or activists. And one pattern that is evident in this ternary plot is that there is a certain ordering in terms of the assignment probabilities that we see at the individual level. So people whose most frequent assignment involves being an apathetic. So for those people, the second most common assignment is being classified as a moderate. And they have relatively low probabilities of being classified as activists. And conversely, for people who have high probability of being classified as activists, their second more common assignment tends to be being classified as a moderate, and they tend to have low probabilities of being classified as apathetics. So now what I'm going to show you is how the baseline participation probabilities varies across estimated types and political activities. So what do I mean by baseline probabilities? So these are the probabilities that an individual with average values of the independent variables, okay, participates in the different activities, depending on whether this person has an activist type, a moderate type, or an apathetic type. So activities are sorted from left to right along the horizontal axis, depending on the likelihood that a moderate would be involved in that activity. So if we focus on moderates, we see that these people have a very high likelihood of voting in national elections and of voting in local elections, and also a pretty high probability of engaging in political discussion. Compared to moderates, activists have slightly larger probabilities of participating in these three activities as well, of voting in national elections, in local elections, and engaging in discussion, but they are also very likely to do other things. So activists, for instance, are also very likely to have a membership in an organization that takes stances on political issues. They're also very likely, for instance, to contact national government officials. Okay? Activists are also quite likely to donate money, to participate in formal and informal community activities, and to contact local government officials. So they do that about 50% of the time, which is much more frequently than the involvement of moderates in the same activities. Okay? So something that even activists don't do very frequently, at least in this sample, is volunteering to do campaign work and participating in protests. Although their participation in that activities is about twice as frequent as the participation in the same activities by moderates. Okay? When it comes to apathetics, these people have very low probability of involvement in most activities, except for voting in national elections and participating in political discussion, which they do about 50% of the time. Okay? For most other activities, they have much lower participation probabilities, especially when you compare them to the other two types. And so when I talked about what were my expectations regarding what we were going to find when applying this model to data of this type, so I said that I expected the impact of a marginal increase in access to resources, okay, to vary across participatory types, depending on the type of activity. Okay. So here I'm going to try to illustrate the fact that findings point precisely in that direction, and I'm going to do so using these plots that show credible intervals and point estimates for a marginal increase in education. Okay, for the effect of a marginal increase in education on the probability of participating in all the activities considered in the analysis for individuals with apathetic, moderate, and activist types. So just to help viewers visualize the results, for each activity, I identified the type that had the largest estimated effect, okay? And I colored the effect, the estimates of the effect on the credible interval for those types in red. Okay, so for instance, in the case of voting in national elections, if in voting in local elections and engaging in political discussion, estimated effects are largest for apathetics. Okay, they are considerably larger for apathetics than they are for activists, for instance. When it comes to activities that are typically considered to be more demanding, effects are larger for activists than for apathetics. Okay, so for instance, activists, the effect of a marginal increase in education is larger for activists than for apathetics in the case of volunteering to perform campaign work, contacting local government officials, engaging in informal community activities, for instance. Okay, so this result is consistent with my expectation, and something that is important to recognize is that the reason why this happens is in part because of parametric assumptions that are made, that I made while estimating the model. And I think that these assumptions make sense in the context of this particular application. So because, for instance, in the case of activists, these are people for whom, when it comes to voting in national elections, voting in local elections, and engaging in political discussion, for instance, the estimates of the intercept tend to be very large. Okay? So if we consider average level of the individual attributes included in X, these people are going to be predicted to perform these activities very frequently. So you saw that before when I showed you the plot, the bar plot with baseline participation probabilities for a different type. So for these individuals, if you increase the level of educational attainment, for instance, the model will predict only small increases in the probability that the person will participate in these activities. Okay. Okay, and the opposite happens with apathetic. So we can talk more about that during the Q&A session. So here are similar plots, but showing the effect of an increase in time spent at work. So we would expect that the more time people spend at work, the less time they will have available to participate in political activities. So this is one independent variable whose effect are expected to be negative, but actually the coefficient associated with this variable, the estimate was close to 0 and not statistically significant for most political activities. So the only two activities that seem to be where there seems to be a significant association between time spent at work and whether people participate or not have to do with participation in informal community activities and volunteering for campaigns. So in those cases, an increase in time spent at work seemed to depress participation a little bit, but not much. So effects are typically small in magnitude. So the idea is that for us to see really variation in the estimates of effects across groups, then of effects of a certain variable across types of individuals, that variable needs to have a significant impact on the latent utility Y star in the first place. If the beta parameter corresponding to that independent variable is statistically indistinguishable from 0, then the effect will be not significant for across the board for all types. And the reason is because, and this is again something that we can talk about in more detail during the Q&A session, is that I'm only allowing the intercept to vary across types, but not the slopes. And that's in part because of data limitations. Like I just cannot estimate all of these parameters at the same time, okay, allowing both intercepts and slopes to vary across types. And here are the similar estimates corresponding to the effect of an increase in job skills. And so these estimates are pretty similar in magnitude, and the patterns that we see are also pretty similar to those seen for the effect of an increase in educational attainment. So, so something that I'm not doing in this paper is to try to explain why we're seeing these differences. Okay, so why it is that some individuals participate systematically more than others, okay, after taking into account their access to resources. So, and the reason is in part when it comes to this data set is that, so for the analysis presented here, I use cross-sectional data. So both the measures of political participation and measures of political attitudes, for instance, that are included in this data set are measured contemporaneously. So I cannot make credible causal claims regarding whether certain attitudes are driving this systematic differences in participation that we observe. So the most that I can tell you is that there is a correlation between certain measures, for instance, of political attitudes and political information and the type assignments that I introduced before. So for instance, people who perform better in tests of their level of political information are more likely to be classified as activists. So the average level of political information is higher among activists than among moderates and apathetics. So activists also have a stronger sense of political efficacy, although differences are not very large compared to other groups. Activists also have a slightly stronger feelings of partisan attachment, and activists are also asked to participate more frequently, okay, than people assigned either moderate or apathetic types. Again, I'm not saying anything about causality. I'm just telling you that there are some correlations in the data. So something that I'm working on right now, I'm not presenting these results here because these other results are very preliminary, and so the results that are presented so far are ones that I analyzed in a version of the paper that I wrote a long time ago, and right now I'm doing new analysis that involve using panel data. Okay, so I learned years after doing the analysis that I presented, years after first looking at the data for the CPS, that there is also re-interview data. So some of the people who were interviewed in 1990 were re-interviewed between 3 to 4 years later. Okay, so a relatively small sample, so of close to 600 individuals were re-interviewed and asked again about their level of political involvement. And so I'm currently trying to determine whether people who were assigned, for instance, activist types based on their self-reported involvement in 1990, also report higher levels of political involvement compared to people who were assigned moderate and apathetic types in 1990 when they are re-interviewed 3 to 4 years later. And what I've seen so far is that, yes, there are, so it seems as if this heterogeneity persists over time. Okay? So these people who systematically participate more than others in 1990 continue to do so 3 to 4 years later. And then something else that I'm trying to think about is like how to approach the second stage of the analysis, whether to just estimate types for time t equal 1, for instance, and use it to predict behavior in time equal t plus 2, or for instance, whether to simply estimate a model where we have where I estimate latent types repeatedly at different moments in time, and then I see for each individual how the type evolves over time. But well, so that's the new part of the analysis that I'm working on right now, and unfortunately, like I'm not yet able to show you those results. It's something that I'm thinking about actually at the moment. Okay, so what are the conclusions of my analysis? Is that well, it's clear that large heterogeneities in political participation exists that cannot be explained purely in terms of access to resources. It's a latent heterogeneity, like systematic differences in participation in political activities that do not fit this resource mobilization hypothesis. Then we can use techniques such as finite mixture modeling to try to learn about these latent participation intensities. And based on the analysis that I conducted so far, we can see that the influence of access to resources, okay, varies across individuals depending on the latent type and also depending on the type of political activity. Okay. And then the last thing that I wanted to emphasize is that so it's important to know that in order to learn about these latent heterogeneities and to take them into account when making predictions about whether someone is going to participate or not in a certain activity, okay, we need to take into account involvement not in a single political activity, but in a range of political activities, as I said before, and not just any set of political activities, but activities that are sufficiently diverse in terms of how demanding they are. Okay? Because only then will we be able to learn about these latent types and to take them into account when making predictions about that person's behavior. So suppose that you're an analyst who's interested in predicting whether someone is going to vote, or you're interested in whether educational attainment is associated with higher likelihood of voting. Then it is important, if you want to be able to make accurate predictions, not just for an average individual sample that you're considering, but for the different types of individuals that exist in the sample, then it's not enough to just focus on voting. You also need to look at individual decisions as to whether to participate or not in other types of activities. So the title of the paper I'm working on is the one that I gave at the very beginning. It's the same one as for the talk, and it's currently under revision. So here I'm giving you the information about the data that I've been using so far to apply the model. And then I also wanted to include information in this last slide about other studies that I've worked on with other co-authors, with Mike Alvarez, with Andy Sinclair, with Lucas Nunez, that are different because they look at different substantive questions, and the methods that are used are also somewhat different to the ones that I use here. But they also deal with kind of trying to learn about latent participation intensities. So if some of you are interested in learning more about this topic, then I encourage you to take a look at these papers. Okay, so this is all.
Great. Thank you very much, Ines, for that presentation. This point, Ines is available to take questions from the audience. You can ask a question using the Zoom Q&A button that appears at the bottom of the webinar screen. And actually, I have a couple of questions, if you don't mind, and I'll throw other people in as they enter their questions in as well. So let me ask, so what's the bottom line here? It strikes me that the technique seems very useful. It's a nice reuse of some old data that's widely available. So is this really about resource mobilization, or is it really about the ability for individuals to digest information? So education and job skills both seem to be important for differentiating these types. But these seem to be not so much resources in the traditional sense, but rather cognitive resources that are useful in navigating kind of a complex world. So do you think this is about money, or is it about cognition?
Yeah, so my sense is that in the typical definition of what are politically relevant resources, so that definition is quite broad. So it includes people's level of education, and one of the reasons why education is considered to be an important resource is precisely because of what you mentioned, because then people who are more educated will have more cognitive abilities, will be able to think more deeply about politics and so on. So I think that what you mentioned is contained within like the standard notion of resources. It's a very broad definition of kind of what constitutes a resource. Okay,
that sort of makes sense. But I think you really have a nice track on thinking about this in a different way than the participation mobilization people have typically thought about it, which really is, just pecuniary resources, monetizing what's available. And really you're pointing at something I think maybe that's more basic in terms of capacity and skill. Mm-hmm. Let me ask a second question. You note in the talk and on one of the slides that you're using a latent utility model where that thing is measured as kind of a linear measure of resource access. And so how sensitive is the model to that assumption of linearity in those resources?
So that's something that I haven't yet assessed. So I'm working on developing a simulation study to try to look at that. But something that it could clearly be a problem if there's a nonlinear relationship between some of these resource measures and the latent utility. And I'm making this assumption that the relationship is linear, because then what's going to happen is that if you look at the composition of people classified as having these different types, they are going to differ in terms of their levels of resources, because we didn't fully control for how resources impact participation. Okay? Because we made an assumption about that relationship that is not correct. So we might see people. So the idea is, if we use the wrong specification, we might see differences in terms of how much people classify as different types, like participate in politics, that might actually be related to their access to resources. Okay? Because I didn't appropriately control for their access to resources, because I made a certain assumption about how resources affects involvement, but that assumption is unrealistic. Okay, so it can definitely be a problem. But something that's nice is that I think that this is something that we can actually evaluate. Okay, so I'm trying to figure out at the moment whether a good test of whether we use a specification that does the job correctly or not is to, after estimating the types, taking a look at the distribution of the independent variables, including in the X vector, within the different types. And if you see that there are considerable differences, I think that that's probably a signal that the model was potentially misspecified. But that's something that I'm working on, and it's definitely an issue. But hopefully there are ways or things that we can do to kind of.
That sounds great. So, one of the problems always is that you're trying to estimate these with measures that you didn't, not of your own choosing. So if you could have the perfect world where this was an updated study, what kind of resource measures might you want to collect other than the ones that this old study collected? Have you given any thought to what kinds of resources might be better predictors in your model than what was available?
So I haven't thought about that much yet, but I think that the American Citizen Participation Study contains some of the best and more detailed information that we have about access to this type of resources. So the problem is that it's a study that was conducted a long time ago, but I don't know of any other study who has as much detailed information about whether people have time to participate in politics, whether people have different types of civic skills, so it's something that I would definitely have to think more about, whether there are some other measures that I should be including that right now I'm not. But precisely one of the reasons why I use the ACPS data is because it's quite rich when it comes to measures of resources.
Yes, as you noted, it's a little dated.
Yes.
Do you think times have changed at all? That kind of levels of polarization in the country, if it's trickled down to citizens, do you think there's some other key aspect that might be driving types of participation now that we hadn't seen back in the 80s when the study was conducted?
Yeah, so for instance, something that's clearly missing from my analysis is there's nothing related to online involvement, and for obvious reasons. And so, of course, if I were to be doing this type of analysis using data collected more recently, I would incorporate information about online civic engagement. And also something else so the literature in participation has evolved a little bit in more recent decades, in the sense that more attention is being paid to also unconventional forms of involvement, from things not only including protesting, but for instance, boycotting products for political reasons and things like those. And so it would also be interesting to estimate a model that considers not only conventional activities, as I did here, so there's a measure of protesting, but that's the only measure of unconventional participation, but also measures of other types of involvement. I recently conducted a survey in California where people were asked about involvement in numerous conventional and unconventional activities, and the limitation that there is that very few people say that they do things such as participation in strikes, blocking roads, occupying buildings, protesting, boycotting products. So even if we can ask those questions, we might not have enough information in the answers that we can use to make these models a little bit richer.
Okay, so we have time for one last question, which just came in. The question asks, how would you describe the substantive interpretation of this latent propensity that you identify? Could this be understood as another way of measuring political interest? Or do you think it's capturing something that's substantively different from interest?
So I think that these latent heterogeneities probably capture a mixture of many things. So there could be psychological predispositions that drive certain people to participate more than others, kind of sociability, for instance. It could have to do with people's positions within social networks. It could be political interest. There are so many things that could be causing some people that we do not observe directly, and that could be driving some people to systematically participate more than others. I don't think that there is one single unobserved attribute that's driving all of these heterogeneities. It's most likely the case that we have kind of several unobserved variables that jointly drive certain individuals to participate more than others.
Great. Thank you very much. Well, that's all the time we have for this week's International Methods Colloquium. I'd like to thank Ines Levin for being our presenter this week, and her presentation will be posted to the website shortly after this broadcast if you'd like to watch it again later. Next week, March 3rd at noon Eastern Time, we'll host a talk by Laura Prather of the University of California, San Diego. She'll be giving a talk entitled An Experiment on the Use of Electronic Devices to Collect Survey Data. So please see our website, methods-colloquium.com, to get more information about this talk and the rest of our schedule for spring of 2017. Thank you very much, Ines. Appreciate it. See, Justin, we'll see everyone next week. I'm just standing in for him this week. Thanks. Thanks a lot, Ines. Bye-bye.